March 17, 1962. Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary. The screaming started at 3:14 a.m. Eddie "Snake" Malone was thrashing in his bunk, blood soaking through bandages wrapped around his head. Both ears were gone, cut clean off. The guards found no weapon, no blood trail, no witnesses. Just Eddie, screaming that the devil himself had visited him in the night. But it wasn't the devil. It was something far more patient. It was Bumpy Johnson, and 72 hours earlier, Eddie made a mistake that would cost him everything. To understand what happened, you need to understand who Eddie Malone was. Snake wasn't his nickname because he was smart. Inmates called him that because he slithered between crews, selling information to whoever paid. He'd been in Alcatraz since 1959 for armed robbery and murder, shot a black store owner in Mississippi during a robbery, left him paralyzed, got 25 to life. Eddie grew up in rural Georgia, raised by a father who'd been in the Klan. That hatred ran deep. By 16, he'd been arrested twice for assault. Both victims were black. Both times police let him walk. When Eddie arrived at Alcatraz, he wasn't scared. He was excited. Here, his racism wasn't a crime. It was currency. In Alcatraz, Eddie thought he'd found paradise, a place where his racism was shared by dozens of other inmates. The Aryan Brotherhood ran Tier 3. They controlled contraband, gambling, even some guards. Eddie paid his dues, and in return he operated freely. He ran a gambling ring making $200 a month, had 3 guards on his payroll, had a cellmate too scared to talk. Eddie felt untouchable, and that feeling made him reckless. Bumpy Johnson had been in Alcatraz since 1952, 10 years in the most brutal prison in America. He was 55 now, gray in his hair, lines carved deep in his face, but his eyes still had that cold, calculating look that made hardened criminals nervous. Alcatraz was supposed to break men. The Rock, isolated on an island in San Francisco Bay. No contact, no privileges, no mercy. Al Capone lost his mind here. Machine Gun Kelly died here. Robert Stroud spent 42 years in solitary. But Bumpy adapted. He didn't join a gang, stayed neutral, respected boundaries, minded his business. But neutrality wasn't weakness, it was power. Bumpy had something other inmates didn't: reputation. When he arrived in 1952, word spread fast. This was the man who'd survived wars with Dutch Schultz, who'd negotiated with Lucky Luciano, who'd protected Harlem for 30 years. In Alcatraz, reputation was currency, and Bumpy's was worth more than gold. He spent his days reading philosophy, history, Shakespeare. Guards thought it was strange, a black gangster reading Plato, but Bumpy knew the mind was the only weapon they couldn't take away. Everyone knew who he was. Everyone knew to stay out of his way. Until March 14, 1962. It was lunchtime. The cafeteria was packed. 200 men eating tasteless food on metal trays. Metal scraping metal, conversations echoing off concrete walls. The smell of overcooked vegetables and stale bread hung in the air. Bumpy sat alone at a corner table, reading a smuggled newspaper. The New York Times, 3 days old. An article about the Cuban Missile Crisis. Kennedy and Khrushchev playing nuclear chess while the world held its breath. Eddie walked past with his crew, 5 white inmates, all Aryan Brotherhood. Dale Hammer Hendricks, 6'4", serving life. Tommy Icepick Lawson, thin as a rail. Ray Stoltz, covered in Nazi tattoos. Eddie had been drinking hooch that morning. Prison-made alcohol, strong enough to strip paint. It made men stupid, made them brave when they should have been smart. Then Eddie saw Bumpy. His crew went quiet. They knew who Bumpy was. But Eddie was too drunk, too stupid to care. He stopped at Bumpy's table, leaned down close. "Hey boy," Eddie said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "You reading? Didn't know your kind could read." Conversations died down. Heads turned. Bumpy didn't look up, just kept reading, his finger tracing the line. Eddie smiled. He reached down and flicked the newspaper from Bumpy's hands, pages scattered on the floor. "I'm talking to you, Annan." That's when Bumpy looked up. No anger, no fear, just those cold, empty eyes. And then Bumpy smiled. A smile that said, "I'm going to remember this." "My apologies," Bumpy said quietly. "Didn't mean to ignore you." Eddie's crew laughed. They thought Bumpy was backing down. "That's what I thought," Eddie said. "Show some respect next time, boy." Bumpy nodded slowly. "I'll remember that." Eddie walked away, chest puffed out. He thought he'd just put Bumpy Johnson in his place. He had no idea what he'd started. Here's what Eddie didn't know about Bumpy Johnson. Bumpy had spent 40 years in the criminal underworld. He'd survived wars, negotiated with mob bosses, built an empire from nothing. He'd learned something most men never learned. Revenge isn't about speed. It's about precision. In prison, time moved differently. You had all the time in the world, and patience was deadlier than any knife. Bumpy could have shanked Eddie right there, could have had him beaten in the yard. But that wasn't Bumpy's style. Violence without a lesson is just noise. Over the next 3 days, Bumpy watched Eddie like a scientist studying a lab rat. He watched Eddie work the laundry room, running his gambling operation. Watched him meet with corrupt guards every Tuesday and Friday. Watched him eat lunch, walk the yard, always in the same spots. Bumpy learned Eddie's patterns, his routines, his weaknesses. Eddie was predictable, same schedule every day. In prison, predictability was death. Eddie was overconfident, thought his crew made him untouchable. It didn't. Not in the dead of night. But Bumpy's real advantage was information. He'd spent 10 years building a network. Not through fear, through respect. And most importantly, Bumpy had Tommy Watts, Eddie's cellmate. Tommy was 19, scrawny, terrified. He'd killed his abusive stepfather in self-defense, got 20 years. Eddie made his life hell, beat him regularly. 3 days after the cafeteria incident, Bumpy sat next to Tommy at dinner. "Tonight," Bumpy said quietly. "When it happens, keep your eyes closed. You didn't see anything. Understand?" Tommy nodded, terrified but grateful. On March 16th, Bumpy made a phone call through a guard who owed him. The call went to New York, to an associate named Quick Lewis. "I need something sent in," Bumpy said. "Something sharp, something small." "When?" "Tomorrow, kitchen delivery." By noon the next day, a straight razor was in Bumpy's hands, the same kind he'd carried in Harlem for 30 years. That night, Bumpy waited until lights out, 10 p.m. The guards did their final rounds at 10:30, then wouldn't return until 6 a.m. At 10:45 p.m., after the last footsteps faded, Bumpy sat on his bunk, listening. Alcatraz at night was never quiet. Men coughed, snored, cried, some prayed in whispers. The building creaked and groaned, old concrete and rusted metal settling in the cold San Francisco Bay wind. But Bumpy knew the difference between normal sounds and danger sounds. He'd spent 10 years learning this prison's rhythms, its breathing, its heartbeat. At 11 p.m., he stood up. His cell door should have been locked, but Bumpy had spent 3 months cultivating a relationship with a maintenance worker named Garcia. Garcia had a gambling debt. Bumpy helped make it disappear. In return, Garcia left the locking mechanism loose. Bumpy pressed, the door clicked open. He moved through the darkness, 15 steps to the stairwell, up 13 steps to Tier 3, 22 steps to Cell 47. He'd walked this route 5 times in his mind, every creak in the floor, every shadow, every possible complication mapped out and neutralized. The only light came from red emergency exit signs, casting everything in a dim crimson glow that made the corridors look like the inside of a beating heart. Eddie was on the top bunk, snoring. Tommy was on the bottom bunk, eyes open. When Tommy saw Bumpy's silhouette, Bumpy put one finger to his lips. Tommy nodded, then turned to the wall. Bumpy walked to Eddie's bunk. The razor was unfolded now, 7 inches of surgical steel. He leaned down close to Eddie's ear, whispered, "You wanted me to remember. I remembered." Eddie's eyes flew open. He saw Bumpy, saw the razor. His mouth opened to scream. Bumpy's hand clamped over Eddie's mouth. "Make a sound," Bumpy whispered, "and I take more than your ears." Eddie froze, terror in his eyes. Bumpy shifted his weight, pressing his forearm across Eddie's throat. Not choking, just enough pressure to pin him. "You disrespected me in front of 200 men," Bumpy said quietly. "Thought I was weak. Thought 10 years made me soft." Eddie's hands came up, trying to push Bumpy away, but Bumpy's grip didn't budge. "Now I'm going to teach you what disrespect costs." Bumpy pulled out the razor, held it where Eddie could see it. Eddie's eyes went wide. He started thrashing. "Stay still," Bumpy said. "This'll hurt less if you stay still." What happened next took less than 90 seconds. Bumpy didn't hack, didn't saw. He cut with surgical precision. One ear. The razor sliced through cartilage like butter. Eddie's scream was muffled by Bumpy's hand, his body convulsed. Blood flowed hot and dark. Then the other ear. Same precision, same smooth cut. When it was done, Bumpy wrapped Eddie's head in the bedsheet, tied it tight. "You'll live," Bumpy said quietly. "But every time you look in a mirror, you'll remember. You'll remember that you insulted Bumpy Johnson, and you'll remember what it cost you." Then Bumpy walked out, down the corridor, back to his cell. He washed the razor, folded it, hid it. By the time Eddie started screaming at 3:14 a.m., Bumpy was asleep, peaceful as a baby. The guards found Eddie thrashing, blood everywhere. They rushed him to the infirmary. The prison doctor took one look and went pale. Both ears were gone, surgically removed. Clean cuts, professional work. This was a message. Warden Blackwell launched an investigation. Someone had gotten out of their cell, moved through locked corridors, committed precise violence, and disappeared. They questioned every inmate on Tier 3, 40 men, 40 statements. Nobody saw anything. Nobody heard anything. They searched every cell, looking for the weapon, blood, evidence. They found nothing. Tommy Watts was questioned for 3 hours. "I was asleep," Tommy said, voice shaking. "I woke up when Eddie started screaming." The guards didn't believe him, threatened him with solitary, promised protection if he talked. Tommy's story never changed. "I was asleep." Because Tommy knew, if he said Bumpy Johnson's name, he wouldn't live to see trial. Eddie was kept in the infirmary for 4 days. The wounds healed fast, but Eddie didn't recover. He stopped eating, stopped talking, just stared at the wall, hands reaching up to touch the bandages. The guards asked over and over, "Who did this?" Eddie never answered. Because Eddie knew, saying Bumpy's name would be a death sentence. And worse than fear was shame. Eddie had spent 3 years building a reputation. In 90 seconds, Bumpy destroyed all of it. 3 days later, Eddie was transferred to Leavenworth, Kansas. Protective custody. The official reason, for his own safety. The real reason, Blackwell didn't want another incident. Eddie served 15 more years in isolation, 6x8 cell, alone, terrified of every shadow, every footstep in the corridor, every sound in the night. Released in 1977, moved to a trailer park in rural Texas, lived on disability checks, never married, never had friends, never spoke unless he had to. The other trailer park residents called him the quiet one. Nobody knew his past, nobody knew what he'd done or what had been done to him. People noticed the scars where his ears used to be, asked what happened. Eddie never answered, just touched the scars and looked away, his eyes distant, seeing something nobody else could see. He died in 1984. Heart attack. Found 3 days later by a neighbor who noticed the smell coming from the trailer on a hot Texas afternoon. When they cleaned out his trailer, they found almost nothing. No photos, no letters, no personal belongings, just a mattress on the floor, a few clothes and a mirror cracked down the middle that he'd apparently stopped using years ago. No funeral, no mourners, just a county burial in an unmarked grave. Bumpy Johnson stayed in Alcatraz until 1963. When he walked out on June 7th, he was 56, gray-haired, weathered, but his eyes still had that same cold look. 300 inmates watched him leave, some with respect, some with fear, all knowing they'd witnessed something rare, but still untouchable. The story of Eddie Malone's ears became legend. Inmates whispered about it for years. "You see Bumpy Johnson? Don't stare, don't talk, don't look at him wrong. You know what he did to Snake Malone?" The guards eventually figured it was Bumpy. Had to be. Nobody else had the skill, the patience, the calculation, but they could never prove it. Bumpy never changed his routine, never acted suspicious, just sat in the yard, reading his books, calm as Sunday morning. Bumpy returned to Harlem, took back his territory. The streets welcomed him like a king returning from exile. Within weeks, every operation he'd left behind was running again. Within months, everyone remembered why they'd feared him in the first place. He ran his operation for 5 more years, until he died in 1968. Heart attack at Wells Restaurant, surrounded by friends, a glass of cognac in his hand. But the lesson lived on. Respect isn't given, it's taken. You can insult a man, disrespect him, challenge him, but if that man is Bumpy Johnson, you better be ready to pay. Because Bumpy didn't get angry, he got even. And when Bumpy got even, he made sure you'd remember it for the rest of your life. Eddie Malone forgot that lesson for one drunken moment. and he spent the rest of his life remembering what it cost him. 2 ears, his reputation, his sanity, and the knowledge that somewhere Bumpy Johnson was walking free, knowing exactly what he'd done, because in the end, that was the real punishment, not the pain, not the scars, but the silence, the weight of carrying what happened, unable to speak it, unable to share it, unable to do anything but touch those scars and remember. Remember the night Bumpy Johnson smiled and said, "I'll remember that." And remember that Bumpy Johnson always kept his promises.